Okay, well, good morning and welcome to Creating Your Legacy, a mid-morning tea with Rebecca Rothey. And we're delighted to have you for what is going to be a thought-provoking and enjoyable conversation about legacy planning. And my name is Mike Persley, and I work in the development office here at MPT. And we are going to be inspired today because we have accredited estate planner Rebecca Rothey here to help us think about our values and how we share them. And in addition, Rebecca is going to give clear steps on how to turn your ideas into a plan that meets the needs of you and your loved ones. And we're so glad that you're with us today, especially during National Estate Planning Awareness Week. So I'm sure you all knew that, and we're glad to have you during this week. So a couple of housekeeping notes. We're recording this, so if you do miss anything, you will be able to view the recording later. And if you have some questions as we go, you can type them into the chat box, and I'll be monitoring them and have some time for Q&A at the end. And in terms of today's format, our seminar this morning will go for about 1 hour. And I'm going to start us out with a quick warm-up poll. So we will have a little bit of interactive questions at the very beginning. And then Rebecca will present. And then we're going to have your questions at the end, and then we'll wrap it up. And also, before we get going, a quick disclaimer. Today, we're giving general information to help you think through your goals and plans. And we're going to be giving a big picture view of estate planning. And before you make any decisions, please consult with your own advisors. And with that, let us get started with our poll, and then we're going to move into Rebecca's wonderful presentation. So, our poll. We have 3 questions, and it's a multiple choice, and you can type your answer into the chat. The first question: planned under the guidance of a beloved children's television host, this organization supports and enriches the important work of those who help children learn and grow. And so the choices are the Fred Rogers Center, Barney College, Blues Clues University, and the Howdy Doody Foundation. So please type your answer into the chat. The answer is Fred Rogers Center. Next, in Downton Abbey Season 4, Branson struggles to pay death duties. Death duties was another term for an oath of allegiance, B, airport shopping, C, inheritance tax, or D, funeral costs. The answer is C, inheritance tax. And our final question: conflicts over using the name and likeness of this popular painter of happy little trees have occurred between his family and his former business partners since his passing. And our choices are A, Michelangelo, B, Bob Ross, C, Kandinsky, or D, Andy Warhol. So take a second and throw your response into the chat. And our answer is B, Bob Ross. All right, well, I hope you got most, if not all of those correct, and thank you for playing along. Now today I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Rebecca Rothey is Chief Philanthropy Officer at Greater Washington Community Foundation. An accredited estate planner, Rebecca has held leadership roles in charitable gift planning at major institutions throughout our region. And most importantly, she is a Maryland Public Television member who kindly volunteered to give this presentation because she loves the station and PBS programming. Rebecca, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks for that fun poll. It's always fun to think about the history of estate planning because there is actually very interesting history there, which is a topic for another day. So it's my pleasure to spend some time with you. As Mike said, I am an MPT member. In fact, MPT in this last year and a half has been extremely important. I think I credit MPT for single-handedly saving my marriage. As many of you have, I'm sure I have watched more television in the last year and a half than I think I have in the last 15 years. I tend to be an out and about kind of person, particularly enjoying cultural opportunities. And obviously in the last year and a half, that's been increasingly difficult. And I made the mistake of not interviewing my husband about his television watching tastes as we were becoming a couple and moving towards marriage. And he tends to like those shows, you know, where somebody kind of gets chopped up and fed to the fish. And that's not really my taste in television programming. And I tend to like these kind of heady comedies that integrate philosophy, you know, and other esoteric things into comedic moments. And he just has absolutely no tolerance for those whatsoever. And what we have found is that one of the television watching preferences that we both have in common is historical fiction, historical programming, and to a certain degree, costume dramas. And so when we are, you know, at loggerheads and we're like, what are we going to watch? It has always been MPT's programming. And we're at the point now where, you know, anytime we see a man on horseback, we watch so many episodes of Poldark, we're like, you know, another program comes on and we're like, oh, there's a guy on horseback again, because we watch so much of that programming. So it's really a lot of fun to be able to spend some time with you and to, you know, express my gratitude in this way through this presentation. So I'm going to give you one Zoom tip. I know we're all, you know, we've been on so many Zoom meetings, we're all pretty experienced with this by now, but I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking. I have slides really as prompts. I'm not a big believer in speaking from slides. You know, I trust my audiences to be able to read. And so the slides are really kind of just guideposts through this talk. So if you see those two double lines in the middle of your screen, you can actually take your cursor and make your speaker view larger and the slides smaller. And then also if you go up to view, you can put your view in speaker view, and that way, you know, you can see the presenter. I'm not being heavily self-promoting here, but you know, I find it, you know, when I'm on a Zoom meeting, you know, I prefer being able to watch the speaker and see the speaker, and that way you're not sitting there staring at a slide with a, you know, little box in the corner while I'm speaking. So before I fully barrel in, I did want to just reemphasize what Mike said. I am an accredited estate planner, and I got that designation in order to understand what you as a donor are considering when you are doing your estate planning. So I did it to become knowledgeable about the language, but I am not an attorney, and I'm not in this presentation giving legal advice. I strongly encourage you to work with an attorney or with some of the platforms that are available that can guide you through the legal aspects of the decisions that you make when planning your estate. And I do think Mike and Aaron are going to offer future presentations more specific to estate planning, and I strongly encourage you to attend those as well. I'm also a chartered advisor in philanthropy. And what I bring to this presentation really is much more my experience as a chartered advisor in philanthropy in the various roles that I've had throughout my career. I was a proud Baltimorean until about 6 years ago when I met my husband and got recruited to the role I have currently in Washington, D.C. And so I'm going to share stories of both my experiences in Baltimore and in the position that I hold now. And those are going to be stories of the work that I've done with generous folks like you as they've sat to plan their philanthropic legacy. So my emphasis through this talk is really going to be more the philanthropic side of estate planning, and it's intended to help you be prepared when you're ready to make decisions and to put a plan into place. So before I go, I'm going to give an overview of what community foundations are and what they do, just very, very briefly, just because it's helpful in this context. But before that, I want to share just sort of some very high level things that I've learned through this process. I've worked with many individuals and I've worked with many couples, and I've worked with childless individuals, individuals with children. I've worked with couples who are either childless and or who have children. And I have found that no matter, what those circumstances, the process of planning a legacy is a challenging process. And if I were giving this talk in person, which I cannot tell you enough how much I wish I were, I would at this point pause and ask for a show of hands. And what I would ask is, how many of you love the idea of spending hundreds of dollars contemplating your death? And typically, I get nobody who raises their hands when I ask that question. This is why I was thinking about, because this was marketed as being a fun and joyful conversation. And, I don't know, if you looked at that and you said, oh, contemplating my death, how can that be fun and joyful? We're at a place, particularly our culture, we as a culture don't deal well with death. And, and certainly no one, and there's actually research that documents this, because there's research into everything right now. So in case you wanted to know why you don't like contemplating your death, the actual research name for that is mortality salience. And of course, when you're planning an estate, you are actually thinking about, well, what happens when I am no longer here? And it's one of the processes that really makes you confront that in a way that ordinarily we don't. So estate planning, it's not that it has a bad rap, it's just not the first thing we all want to do. And it's very easy to put off for that reason, because it's not something that, we particularly find to be, a pleasurable process. But there is actually a way to make it pleasurable, and that's the fun and joyful part. And that way is that we all want to leave something behind. We're those unique beings on this earth that have the awareness, or most of us are fortunate enough to have an awareness that we exist, that we are sentient beings. And we therefore are aware that we come from people who've lived before us, and we are certainly aware that there will be millions and billions who live after us. And what good legacy planning does is it really enables us to leave that little piece of ourselves that will continue after we are no longer here. And certainly that happens with children most of the time. But there's also ways to do that not are only, sort of physically perpetuate your DNA, but perpetuate the other part of who you are as a human being, and that is your values. So what I've learned in working with, now I think it's up to hundreds of donors, is that what comes into play when you begin an estate planning process, and this is true if you have children or if you don't, is your values. And the way I think about values is I think of them as being like our heartbeat. Most of the time, we know we have a pulse, but unless you have a heart condition that requires you to check your pulse with some frequency, we don't stop every day and check our pulse. There are certain circumstances where we become aware of it, like if we have to hike up more stairs than we're used to, or we do a run or something. But even then, we sort of take for granted that we have that pulse. And values are the same thing. We all have them. Every single person has values. And those values really form the foundation for how we interact and engage in the world. But most of the time, we don't think about them. They are so much a part of the fabric, the arteries of who we are as human beings, that we don't stop and check that pulse every day. And what happens when you begin to do an estate plan is that is one of the times when it's important to stop and take your pulse and figure out what your pulse is, and then use that pulse and apply that pulse to estate planning. So we're going to talk about how to do that. And I'm going to give you some examples, and then I'm going to talk about various methods that can be applied for planning a charitable legacy. So with that, Mike, can we go to the first slide? Okay, so GWCF stands for Greater Washington Community Foundation. So you know why they abbreviated on this slide, because otherwise the slide would be off the page. The Greater Washington Community Foundation is a community foundation. We're one of about 750 across the country. And I actually had the good fortune of working at the Baltimore Community Foundation. So this is actually my second community foundation. And community foundations typically have sort of the same architecture, but the way that the buildings have been designed can vary. The interiors and sort of the structures on the interior can vary. But what we all have in common is that we're a partner for individuals, corporations, or foundations to create charitable funds that can be used to fulfill the founder's philanthropic objectives. And then we're also leading our own philanthropic work. So community foundations tend to be on the cutting edge of critical issues in the geographic location in which they live. So when I was at the Baltimore Community Foundation, Baltimore focused its discretionary resources on addressing the challenges of public education in Baltimore and in revitalizing neighborhoods. We at the Greater Washington Community Foundation just did a strategic plan, and our vision is Together We Prosper. We have made a 10-year commitment to closing the racial wealth gap in Washington. And so you'll find each community foundation has its own discretionary focus, as well as helping you as a donor achieve your objectives. Next slide, Mike. And so you may be familiar with one of the most common ways community foundations do that, which is through donor advised funds. And my guess is that at least many of you have a donor advised fund or have thought about them. And there are many of we call them commercial gift funds because they're financial institutions that created charities that offer donor advised funds: Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab. They're great. Community foundations actually created donor advised funds back in the 30s. We offer them, but we actually offer a number of other kinds of charitable funds that the commercial gift funds are not able to offer. We offer funds that you can set up that just name a specific organization to get an annual gift in perpetuity. We offer funds that say you love the arts in Baltimore and you just want to perpetuate your support for the arts in Baltimore, and that the community foundation will make those grants every year on your behalf, picking organizations based on the criteria that you set. We offer memorial funds, we offer scholarship funds, and we host giving circles. And I'm going to guess there's at least one member of the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle on this call today. So we make it possible for there to be collective philanthropy. And I mention this because it's relevant to the role that I play in these legacy conversations. And that is because we offer these various ways in which donors can create charitable legacies. We often work with donors to help them achieve their philanthropic objectives through one of these fund structures. Sometimes it is a donor advised fund, but often it's one of these other kinds of funds. And that's given me a privilege, and it truly is a privilege, to sit down and really think through, well, what is it that you want to accomplish with that legacy, and how do we structure that? So the fund is the how, but it starts with the why. And so we're going to do the same thing. So next slide. Okay, so here's the top tips on legacy planning. So legacy planning is sort of this architecture that we've been talking about based on values. And so as you see here in the slide, it says start with values. And typically the way that I'll have a conversation about this is, I'll just ask folks to kind of volunteer, what are the things that have shaped your life and that have been important to you throughout your life? And what are the traditions that influence how you think about yourself in this world? And certainly, family traditions are often, the sort of the top of that list, particularly folks fortunate enough to be in families that have had the capacity and resources to give back and the ability to share resources and who have made that family traditions. Very common is either a desire to give back, a desire to share a blessing. I hate to say it, but right now there's also like what we absolutely hate, and don't care about and want to stop. Sometimes that's sort of the flip side of the sort of sharing a blessing is trying to stop something that is not considered a blessing. There are things that people want to preserve, things that have been or change. Right now, for example, many donors are focused on changing where we're heading with global warming and the threats in our environment. And then the individuals and institutions that have influenced you and your life. And so all of these things, I just ask people to sort of do an inventory of them and think about them from the standpoint of what is it that they want to perpetuate as they plan an estate. And just an aside here, when we're talking about values and talking about estate planning in general, I think one of the reasons why people get hung up when they're beginning an estate planning process is that, when you think about your estate, your estate is, your property, your home, your retirement savings, your assets, you're in a mode of considering monetary values. But, as we've already talked about, when you're planning an estate, you're talking about your values, which are the things you love. And so estate planning requires being in that love part of your brain. And that's why an exercise like this, like, well, what do you love? And what has made such a difference in your life? There can be one mentor who helped you in college figure out what your career path is. And like I do that. When I came to Baltimore, I was in a major life change. And I didn't have a clue how to get into the nonprofit sector or how to do this. And actually a woman who was on this phone call, or not phone call, Zoom meeting, took me under her wing and provided guidance about how to become a development professional in this region. That was years ago. And to this day, when anybody reaches out and asks for help, I offer the time that they need to be able to progress in their career. That's why when Aaron and Mike reached out, it was like, absolutely. So that's become a core value. And that value was shaped by the generous people who took their time to help me get through a difficult period and really land, in a profession that has been rewarding and just the greatest blessing. So Thank you, Barbara. So that, that's the kind of thing that you want to look at. And just to give you other examples from donors with whom I've worked, I worked with a woman in DC. She's single, doesn't have any children, was a career professional, worked at the Department of Education, shared that she loved travel in order to enjoy culture and nature, shared that she really cared about seniors not getting adequate care, and cared about wanting to perpetuate training. She was involved in running training programs through the Department of Education. So she created a fund that named those charitable purposes. It's a permanently endowed fund. We'll get into that in a minute. And in her letter, I encouraged her to write a love letter. And this is part of the process that I encourage folks that I'm working with to do. You need to create the plan, but the plan is the architecture. You need a love letter, sometimes they're called ethical wills, but I hate that term. It just doesn't do it. It's you're writing to the future what you love, and that can be your children, that can be future philanthropy, it can be both. So she wrote, I wish to leave a legacy that encourages future generations to give service to others using that talent and passion for animals, arts, and the environment, so that others might enjoy long lives of joy and independence in a safe and lovely world. So once she had gotten that, then creating the plan itself became easy. So Mike, next slide. Here's my morning tea. Okay, so once you've done that values exercise, then you can actually translate that into the kinds of nonprofits that you would want to support. So here are the kinds of exercises that I encourage donors to go through. And if you're a list maker or an Excel spreadsheet user, those are great ways to do this. I tend to be more of in the creative space, so you can doodle this, you can draw this. There's actually one program that uses photographs. You just kind of put out all these photographs and you look at what you gravitate to. So there's a lot of ways to do this. You want to make this as easy for yourself as possible. But where do you give now? Why do you give? What types of missions? So you may find that there are, like several different organizations, but they have the same kind of mission. What are the top 3? Why did you start giving to them? Why do you keep giving to them? And if you could only support one, which one would it be and why? So what you're doing is you're just working to get yourself to reflect on your current giving. And I think what you're going to find is that there'll be some surprises there. There'll be I'm still giving to them. Why do I keep giving to them? They haven't even thanked me for the last 5 years, which I'm ashamed to say does happen sometimes. On the flip side, you'll be like, yeah, that's the one I really care about, because what you're doing with this exercise is you're kind of getting it out of your head and onto paper in whatever form you prefer to get it onto paper. And when you do that, you're then kind of checking your gut. You're doing a gut check to say, what do I care about the most and why? And is that something, then that next question becomes, is that what I want to perpetuate? Now, I have a word of caution here. I've done this with a lot of donors, and I did this with one fellow not that long ago. And he's, he has no kids, and, he's what I would call affluent. He's not, ultra wealthy, but he's, he's comfortable. And he did this exercise, very generous guy, he's a scientist, he cares about it. He cares about so many things. He did this exercise, he came back and he said, I want to be Bill Gates to be able to do everything I want to do. And he went into a major stall. I mean, he looked just like flared out, and that actually is not uncommon. I worked with a donor when I was at BCF, and he had been trying to figure out his legacy for almost 2 years. And he invited me over for wine, which I never say no to. And we had a conversation through the evening where we talked through these kinds of questions. And coming out of that meeting, he was able to create a plan. And he had a couple of those light bulb moments, and that was enough to move him forward with actually creating an estate plan. And it's not uncommon actually for estate planning attorneys to call me in at this stage because folks do get stuck. So you need to be careful. You need to do this exercise, but you also want to keep yourself moving forward. It's possible to get stuck. And if you do get stuck, then if you stall out, you run that risk of not having a fully executed estate plan, because we, obviously none of us know, when our time is going to be. So give it time, but be careful as you're giving it time, that time is really time when you're allowing to settle in, okay, this is what I really care about. And these are the things that I really want to make a difference in. But don't be surprised if it's not the same as your typical annual giving, because that annual giving is in that transactional part of your brain. And you're in your love brain now, and you're in the, what do you really want to ensure, you continue to tend into the future. So next slide, Mike. So typically the three ways that you can do this is an unrestricted bequest. We're talking about legacy giving now, so you obviously can also make unrestricted current gifts. A specific program or purpose, which in nonprofit parlance is a restricted gift, or a one-time gift that's perpetuated. So that actually should read a perpetual gift. And the key thing here is, I'm sorry, that the language there is you either doing this as a one-time gift in your will, so the nonprofit gets that lump sum all at once, or you're creating an endowment which creates an income stream. And I'll explain that in the next slide. So unrestricted, pretty straightforward. The nonprofit gets to pick where it's needed most. Specific program or purpose or restricted, there are many, many examples. You may want to just support Masterpiece Theater programming. That would be a good example, MPT. At the Johns Hopkins, where I was briefly, there was educational programs, departments within educational departments. There's the whole healthcare. Some of these can be very, very specific to certain kinds of research or certain divisions or directorships within programs. Typically, what you want to do, if you're thinking of any kind of a restriction on your gift, you want to get this in writing. You want to be as clear as possible about what you intend to do. And this is especially important in legacy planning. Development officers, you all know, if you're generous, the places to which you give have a development officer who runs the fundraising for that nonprofit. Those folks aren't there to try to talk you into doing something you don't want to do. Aaron and Mike's job is to know MPT so well that whatever you want to do, they can help you figure out how to do it. They're there as a service to you as a donor to make sure that you can match what you want to accomplish to the work of that nonprofit. And I can't tell you how many horror stories I've heard over my career, and I call them horror stories. They're as bad as some of the terrifying TV programming, because somebody will leave a huge amount of money to a nonprofit and the nonprofit can't use it, because it's for a program or purpose that nonprofit doesn't offer or can't offer. And the donor and the donor's attorney never picked up the phone to call the nonprofit and say, hey, we want to fix, three-legged people in, we want to help, amputate the third leg of people in, Australia. And the nonprofit says, well, I'm sorry, but, that's just not part of our healthcare programming. So you have to be, careful. If there's a restriction, get an agreement with the nonprofit. Every single nonprofit understands that if you're naming a nonprofit in your will or your living trust or as a beneficiary of one of your financial or savings accounts, It's revocable. They know you can change it. It's not legally binding, and no nonprofit worth its salt is going to consider that legally binding. What they want to do is they want to make sure that your objectives can be met, and they also want to make sure that they can say thank you. You know, a lot of folks don't tell nonprofits that they've been included in their plans because they're afraid that it'll be considered an obligation. And then the poor nonprofit can't say thank you, you know, because obviously that can only be done during your lifetime. So let's go to the next slide. Because here's where, now, if you want to think about things that I consider fun and joyful, I consider endowment giving fun and joyful. So now you know I'm kind of eccentric here. But endowments are one of the most powerful things that you can leave to a nonprofit. And at community foundations, we focus on endowment building for our communities. And unfortunately, endowments have been given a bad rap, you know, because, you know, Harvard has, I don't know how many gazillion dollars right now, and everybody's saying, why does Harvard need all that money? Well, Harvard thinks it needs all that money, but it's become sort of this poster child for, oh, endowments are bad. But if you think about the cultural institutions that you enjoy, like if you get down to my neck of the woods and you go to the Smithsonian, guess what? That's funded with an endowment. You know, major institutions in this country have been able to grow and thrive because they have permanent and reliable resources. And from your perspective as a donor, if you leave a $100,000 endowment to MPT, and MPT does offer endowments, what will happen is that gift will generate approximately it depends on the nonprofit, it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 5% a year. And there's usually a formula that protects the principal, so it's not just 5% of the annual valuation. Typically, it's a 3-year, 5-year trailing average. But just say to keep the math simple, it's $5,000 a year. All right, so multiply 5 times 20. You get 100,000. So in year 21, you are still giving $5,000 a year. And you're going to give that $5,000 a year, and it's going to go up a little bit with inflation in perpetuity. So you are going to give far more money than that initial gift, and you're going to give that money forever, which the last time I checked, I think is a pretty long time. And so they're extremely powerful. Nonprofits that had endowments to fall back on during the worst of the Great Recession, during the worst of COVID-19, fared far better than those that were heavily reliant on annual giving that was disrupted by those crises. And this is that chance. The reason I love these, right? That is that little piece of yourself. You know, that's why I encourage folks to write a love letter, like 100 years from now. You know, who knows what the programming is going to be like on MPT, or, you know, maybe we'll be watching it on our palms, or, you know, whatever technology has been developed by that time. But they're still going to be getting that support. And wouldn't somebody love to know why MPT was so important to you and why that support continues to exist? And that's the power of endowment giving. Okay, so now let's just talk about a few estate planning basics. So estate gifts. We've talked a lot about giving a bequest through a will, a trust, or a beneficiary designation. As I've already said, you know, these gifts are all revocable. In plain English, you can change your mind. And I think this is important to realize for a couple of reasons. First of all, for most of us, it's certainly the case for me. My bequests, I don't have children, so I'm leaving all of my estate to a nonprofit that'll administer that for other nonprofits. And, you know, my bequest is going to be far more than I can give as current giving during my lifetime. And I think it's true for most of us. So this is going to be the most significant gift you ever make. So when you go to meet with your attorney, the benefit of having done the process that I've been describing is that attorney, if you're going to a new attorney, that attorney isn't going to even review your prior estate documents. If you already have, will, like maybe you created a will when you had children or when you got married. So you're going to start from scratch. And most attorneys, I'm sorry to say this, but I meet with a lot of estate planning attorneys. Their job is to do what you tell them to do. They do not consider their job to push you to do something you don't want to do. So their typical intake will say, do you want to give to a charity? And it'll just be that simple. So this work that I'm talking about really needs to be done by you before you get into that meeting with that attorney, particularly if you want nuance to that estate plan. And so I always caution nonprofits with which I work that they need to be stewarding you as a donor, particularly if you've been kind enough to share with a nonprofit, you've included it in your estate plan. They need to be saying thank you. They need to be keeping you up to date on the programming, because it's not uncommon for somebody to go into this, into a meeting with an estate planning attorney, and they've got their standard intake form and it says, do you want to support charities? And you're like, oh, who do I give to again? And if that nonprofit is not front of mind, they could actually fall off your list, whether or not you intended for that to be the case or not. So bequest by will or trust, you can leave a specific amount, or you can leave the rest and residue of your estate. And this is where, like, most commonly I work with donors, and I would say 99% of the work that I do is on this slide. And, just another example from donors with whom I've worked. I worked with a couple when I was at the Baltimore Community Foundation, and they had 3 children, blended family, 3 kids. They both had spent their lives and careers in Baltimore, and they loved Baltimore. And they wanted to both share their value of giving back and supporting nonprofits in Baltimore, and of loving Baltimore. So they created a donor advice fund during their lifetime, small. The minimum for most community foundations is $10,000. They made each of their kids an advisor to the fund, which meant that they could recommend where the money would go. And they said, you each get a quarter of this, and then we're going to take a quarter. And every holiday, they asked their kids, all right, where did you give their money? They didn't tell them where they had to give. The value was, you've got this money, you need to grant it, you should give it away. Which, by the way, sometimes can be harder to get your kids to do than you would think. Kids are busy, and if it's not yet their value, it may take some work. It seems like a great thing, but it depends on the kid. There's usually one who is on it like that 5 minutes later, it's like, oh God, I got all this money, but the others can be more reluctant. And then what they're doing is they're naming that donor advice fund in their estate plan. The kids will be the advisors to that fund, and the kids will have that tradition of their parents giving and knowing where their parents gave, but then also the freedom to give where they want. So one example of the way to do this. The others are the ones that I mentioned at the top. At a community foundation, particularly for folks who don't have kids, it's very common to designate several organizations. BCF actually had a fund that supported the Lyric Opera. And when the Lyric Opera went out of business, it repurposed that money to another organization offering opera in Baltimore. And when the Lyric reformed and came back, that money went back to support that work and to support opera in Baltimore in that way. And that's one of the benefits of a community foundation, is that it can perpetuate that kind of support. So next slide. So other options. Now, again, we're talking about estate planning. If we have time at the end, I do have bonus slides about current giving. So we'll see if we have time to get those. If not, they'll be shared when the presentation is shared. So you may have heard that the law changed about 2 years ago regarding inherited IRAs. It was called the Secure Act. And the Secure Act eliminated what was called the stretch IRA. So it used to be the case, if you left your IRA to your children could then take that IRA over their lifetimes, or his or her lifetime if it's one child. And now that IRA has to be withdrawn over a 10-year time period. This was obviously a tax policy, a tax change, because any inherited IRA, the beneficiary, the inheritor, has to pay ordinary income tax on that withdrawal from the IRA. So one technique that has come back into play, and if you have a large IRA, it's worth, and you want to provide an income stream for your children, and it's your only asset through which you could do that, then you can talk about creating a charitable remainder trust that would be, its testamentary would be through your estate, that could leave, basically it's a trust that creates a stream of income, typically 5 or 6%. That goes on for either a term of years that you set, or more typically the lifetime of the beneficiary. When the beneficiary or beneficiaries pass away, then the remainder goes to the charities that you name as the beneficiary of that trust. So that can be a very effective technique, and that can be done either with a charitable remainder trust or with a charitable gift annuity. It's more common with trusts, but gift annuities are a good technique as well. Just a quick note there, fewer and fewer nonprofits are offering charitable gift annuities. We do not at the Greater Washington Community Foundation. MPT doesn't. I know Baltimore Community Foundation still does. So again, a gift annuity is a way to make a gift. You get a fixed income stream. It's partially taxable, partially not, and then the remainder goes to the nonprofit that's named as the charitable beneficiary of that gift annuities. So one more note on IRAs. If you have an estate that has an IRA and then also has other assets, your home, other savings, tangible personal property, business assets, whatever they might be, it is always best to gift your IRA to charity. And that, again, you need to check with your advisor, because sometimes the fact patterns are different, but typically it is best to donate an IRA, because an IRA left to a nonprofit is not taxed. So there's no ordinary income withdrawn. The nonprofit will get the full value of that IRA, and your kids currently will get a step up in basis, which means that, you know, they'll get your other assets at current fair market value. There's some talk about changing that. There's a possibility some of that might change in the current tax laws. Just watch the tax laws and obviously, again, talk to your advisor. But right now, kids will get all the other assets with that step up in basis. So in other words, no taxation. And unless your estate currently is over 11 million, I think it's 35,000, or if you're a couple over 22 or 23 and change, I never commit that number to memory, because can I get a show of hands here of how many people have over 11 million or $22 million? I mean, it's just not that typical. It does happen. And it's fortunate for the folks who do have it. And thankfully, many of those folks are very generous. But that currently is about 0.01% or fewer of the population. So most estates are not subject right now to estate tax. That could change. Watch what's happening with the tax laws, because the current tax law is set to sunset in 2025. That could happen sooner. So it is important to pay attention and to be in communication with your attorney on a regular basis. If your attorney calls you and you're rolling your eyes saying, this is the 10th time they've called me about a change in the tax laws, it's because there's been that many changes in the tax laws, and they're looking out for your benefit and looking for methods to preserve your estate and share it for the things that you care about most. Next slide. And then finally, I just mentioned this here really briefly, which is charitable lead trusts, which are the reverse of a charitable gift annuity. Charitable lead trusts, you actually set up a trust that pays a current income stream to a nonprofit. And then at the end of a term of years, typically 10 or 20 years, the underlying assets, the principal in that trust, goes most commonly to heirs, very often to grandchildren. And the benefit of this is a gift and estate tax strategy, so particularly a gift tax strategy, because this money will come to your children or grandchildren free of gift taxes and outside of your estate. So there's a cumulative amount that you can gift to family members during your lifetimes. It's the gift tax exemption. And this gets confusing because there's a gift tax exemption and then there's an estate tax exemption. Right now, they're coupled, they're the same. And you all know that you can make annual gifts right now of 15, I think the number is 15,000, check that number, but I'm pretty sure it's 15 without any gift tax implication. If you give more than that, you have to do a gift tax return. If you're in the fortunate position to be able to give over $1 million, that's when you need to start tracking this, and it's where this kind of strategy can come into play. So really, mostly, this is a heads up slide. This is a complex strategy, and if it seems relevant, like if you have an asset you just know you want your grandkids to have, you don't need it for anything else, and you want to support a charity with a current income, annual income stream, talk to your advisor. The other thing to talk to your advisor about, and I didn't do a slide about this, but is life insurance, because with these current changes in the tax laws, life insurance is actually coming back into play as a very effective wealth transfer strategy. And again, I know for myself, as much as I've tried to understand life insurance, it's just one of those products that seems ridiculously hard to understand, but it can be a valuable tool. So be sure to explore that as you're looking at this planning. The other thing is, if you have an old life insurance policy, like you had it for your kids, while your kids were young and still in school, and it's either paid up or you don't want to pay the premiums anymore, those can make really terrific major gifts. So if you have one of those, talk with Mike and Aaron, because it's a great way to make a gift and, dust off an asset that you're not using for any other purpose. All right, I think I'm going to take a breath here and let's see if we have any questions.
Rebecca, thank you very much. If anyone does have some questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and we will get to your questions. And if, as folks are getting questions together.
Mike, there is one question on the chat.
Thank you. Okay.
From Lori Goldstein.
Yes, Laurie, what do you mean there's one type of program that uses photographs? A software program, an educational program?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, it was developed by Sharna Goldsecker. Some of you may know of the Goldsecker Family Foundation. It's a longtime Baltimore foundation. And Sharna was Gen 3 in that foundation. And she tells a story of, like, she'd be out at the grocery store and a nonprofit person would come up to her and say, hey, with the Goldsecker Foundation, make a grant. And she'd be like, I'm 20 years old. I don't know, what we're supporting. And she realized nonprofits didn't really understand, the sort of trustee relationships in private foundations. But she also realized that she didn't know what she wanted to support. And so she developed a training. It's called Picture Your Legacy, and her website is 21/64 because it's about intergenerational giving. What she understood is that her values were different than her grandfather's values, and that when she became a trustee, the things that she wanted to support were very different than what her grandfather had envisioned supporting. And she developed a method for bringing generations together. And she found that, as we've been talking about finding the language for what you want your legacy to be often can be very difficult. And so she actually developed a card deck, which has pictures on it. I actually just did this with a couple yesterday. You know, it's got about, I don't know, 30, 40 cards, and it's got, you know, pictures of homeless people. It had a picture of folks jumping out of airplanes. It has pictures of, you know, like a microscope, you know, people in third world countries, arts organizations, and they went through and they picked the 10 they cared about the most, you know, that spoke to them. And then they picked 3, and then they had to explain why they picked 3. And the fellow, he picked the skydivers, you know, so you're like, what does skydiving have to do with philanthropy? And he said, I picked skydiving because I want to get as big a rush out of what I do with my philanthropy as I did when I jumped out of that airplane, which he did only one time. I mean, it was just awesome. So 2164, you can Google it and ask your development officer if you're working with one, you know, whether or not they're trained in it or can refer to it. The Baltimore Community Foundation has staff trained in it. The way we work at the Greater Washington Community Foundation is that for a standard fund, just has a fee, administrative fee associated with the fund, you know, to administer the fund. We do work with families who want more staff intensive support, like this kind of training that we're talking about, or creating charitable dockets. And for that, we charge an additional fee. And that's pretty typical of most community foundations. There's one in Howard County, by the way. That's when I met Barbara. Each Anne Arundel County has a community foundation, Frederick County. So, you know, I encourage you, depending on where you are, you know, to look to your local community foundation, because they know the nonprofits in the community. Their job is not just to help you figure out what you want to do, but also to know the nonprofit community and the greatest needs in the community. Other questions, Mike?
Yes, here's one from Ellen. Is there / what type of fee is there for working with GF?
I think I read Aaron's mind and just answered that question. So yeah, so the fee is typically an administrative fee for setting up a fund, and then additional fees depending on the service.
And we have one from Cher. I have an interest in setting up scholarships for fledgling artists in developing world countries. It is an idea, but I don't have a country or organization in mind. How would I begin this research? And would a foundation be able to help with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So international giving is a little more complicated because of the IRS rules associated with it. And so I would look at organizations that specifically specialize in international giving. There's one called CAF America, CAF America. There's also one called NGO Source. And then there are sort of collective organizations like, for example, Give to Asia is a US 501c3, but it actually serves as an intermediary for giving in Asia. I'm not certain there's an equivalent for that for South America, but there may be. And then I would look at like international scholarship programs. Scholarships in general are tricky because the IRS has a whole set of rules specific to scholarships. For some reason that I've never been able to fully understand, the IRS just really doesn't like it when somebody sets up a scholarship and uses it to pay their grandkids' college tuition. And because there were actually people doing that, the IRS set up really pretty strict rules around how you select scholarship recipients. And it makes it, there's an administrative process in managing a scholarship, which is more labor intensive than typically other charitable funds, because you have to have a committee and you have to have an impartial process and you have to document how you select recipients. So I would look for international scholarship organizations or organizations. In this case, you're actually also talking about really providing cash assistance. It might not even, the word scholarship may not actually be applicable because you're really providing a more like a stipend for an artist. So look at organizations that are doing that kind of work. And, reach out. I think the two community foundations that do a lot of international giving are the Boston Foundation and the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So I would poke around in their two websites because they may also be able to direct you on some of that international giving.
Wonderful. Well, we're at just a little past 11. So to wrap up, Rebecca, thank you so much for your guidance today. And on behalf of MPT, we thank you all for being here and for joining us. And if there's anything MPT can do to help you perpetuate your values with a legacy gift, please be in touch. And I also wanted to share before we break, we do offer a free will writing tool called Free Will, which gets you a 100% legal will that you can create online in about 30 minutes. So this is a resource we want to offer for use in whatever way that you feel best. And if you do not have a will, this is a great way to give yourself peace of mind by creating a legally binding will for free. So if you would like to look into that, you can go to www.freewill.com/MPT. And also, if you like today's seminar and you would like some more information as we go, please stay tuned for future estate planning seminars from MPT. And finally, here are our contact information. So we have Rebecca, we have Aaron Crest, our Managing Director of Major and Planned Giving, and we have yours truly, Major Gift Officer at MPT. So please, if there's anything that we can do to help, just be in touch with us. So thank you so very much. We're so glad to have you here and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure to spend time with you.